Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Murnion, and I am the Executive Director of the Mint Film Festival. Thank you for joining us for this virtual conversation today. I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Tito's Handmade Vodka, and our major sponsor, Kibler and Kirch. Today, we are joined with film director Brandon Colvin with his film, A Dim Valley. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Brian.
Well, I kind of want to just jump right in. This is such a unique film. And everything from the pacing to the tone that you establish with it, to the relationship that the characters have with each other. How did this film come to be?
It started on my previous film, Sabbatical, and it was a conversation that Robert Longstreet and I were having. So Robert is an actor in both films. And we were talking about how there are some elements in Sabbatical that we found really funny, but because that movie is quite dark, especially the first time through, it's hard for people to really see any humor. So we were thinking about how to tell a story in a way that worked with my style, which is like relatively formal and paced in a deliberate way, has a certain kind of vibe. And so I started on this idea of coming up with a script that was going to be something that was like a little bit of a like Jacques Tati kind of like physical formalist comedy. And I worked on ideas for that. That's when the initial ideas of like the scientist characters and doing their stuff came into play. But then I just kind of like got bored of that. And it didn't have enough of a heart for me. And so there was a long period where I was trying to figure out what the real emotional hook for me into the story was going to be. And that's when I started to get interested in, and this was dovetailing with something that had happened in my hometown, which is my hometown in Kentucky is the place where Kim Davis was the county clerk who refused to sign same-sex marriage licenses. And
Right.
so that was bringing to the head a lot of things about the place where I'm from that I didn't like, and how frustrated I was that it's like that is now the thing that people most know my town for. And I thought it felt so upsetting to have so much about the place where I was from and things that I loved about it be like overtaken by this negativity and kind of prejudice and have that especially being wrapped up in like spirituality, that there's some way that there's this religious perspective that's denying people love and compassion. So I was like, okay, so how can I whip my counter argument or my like opposing force to that into the story? And the whole idea of queer sexuality and the romantic tension between the characters sort of like evolved organically, and like it was all those things were just spinning together, and it kept spinning and spinning. And then eventually I just sort of had the urge. I was watching a lot of Miyazaki movies at the time, and I just loved how it felt like anything could happen in Miyazaki's worlds, and that they were fantastical worlds, but they weren't worlds where like someone came out and told you like these are the rules and this is how it goes and only this and this are allowed to happen. But it's just like it was a very fluid, like open approach to integrating fantastical elements. And so I was just like, you know what, let yourself do whatever you feel like doing, just like follow your intuition on this. And so it's funny because that's the process of writing the film, but then I also feel like the trajectory of the film like shows you that process in a certain way, because it kind of starts out as the idea I initially had and then like snowballs out into this like more emotional supernatural kind of thing, and like the tone and vibe of the movie changes a lot over that time.
Yeah, I want to talk about the sexuality of some of the characters. So what I found really intriguing, the characters that, um, well, first, no one references their sexuality, which I thought was interesting, and actually, long overdue in film. You don't have a character talking about being gay; they can just be gay. They can just be attracted the way that they are inclined to be attracted. And I felt like you did such a great job with this film where you just allow those characters to just exist as they are in this world that accepted them as something completely normal, something that you didn't have to talk about and present. And share a little bit about that. It's just refreshing to see.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it to me is just
Was that your intention? Was to
definitely. And it's about like getting at something human that exists a priori to like social labels, where it's just like, if you can get to the point where you're just listening to yourself and like trusting your own feelings and your own desires, like how does that change how you see yourself and how an audience might see a character, where it now becomes it becomes hard. I mean, I often hear people say like, it feels like every character in the movie has some degree of sexual attraction to another, and it kind of shifts depending on what scene you're in, and you might think like this is going this way and then it doesn't, and think this is going this way. And I think that's the kind of thing I want it to be in, where you're just following individuals and trying to understand like what they're thinking and feeling, and being open to any possibility that's going to go. Like, to me, that felt like totally like the way to liberate how my characters were seeing themselves, and trying to help get them to the point where they are just trusting their intuition in a certain way, and just like trusting their hearts in the way that they're navigating those situations. So yeah, I mean, there are oblique references to the way that especially with Robert Longstreet's character, there are references to the way that social restrictions have impinged on these characters in the past, like how his relationship with Jim has possibly and probably been negatively affected by their social context and closeting, and the idea that they can't really be who they want to be fully. And so with this movie, and especially with there's like a divine intervention element to this story, where you have these supernatural beings who kind of come in and change the characters, open them up a little bit, catalyze things within them. And I wanted, when those beings came in, for them to really create a situation where you could see individuals outside of how society would see them. So like, would some godlike being think about, conventional heteronormativity, or like, you're this way or you're that way? Or is there a sense where there's like a different consciousness that's coming into that dynamic? And how do you make the film from that perspective, where you're not trying to lock characters into like this slot or this slot? Does that make sense?
Sure. It does. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Well, with the pacing of the film, it's a very slow film. I found, and it provides a lot of opportunity to reflect and to just absorb the environment that you're creating. Was it difficult to direct a film that followed that pacing? How you use time and its relationship to the characters?
I would say part of this is just affected by my baseline sense of pace, which is for my work, this is probably the quickest paced film I've ever made.
Okay.
And just naturally, the way my creativity works as a filmmaker is in that more reflective, contemplative space, and in in that situation that you're talking about that allows the viewer to, like, I'm really interested in the idea of mystery when it comes to filmmaking and ambiguity, and how that changes the way someone interacts with the story, not just on, well, not especially on a plot or like what's going to happen next kind of way, but more in a sense of like what is going on with this character right now. And that so much of what I'm thinking about when I'm telling a story is trying to structure or at least offer up particular ambiguities, right? So it's not like you're telling a story and anything could be true, but it's you're telling the story, and at this moment, I really want the viewer to be engaged with trying to understand what a character is thinking or feeling, or what is going across, like what that look in their eyes means might be flashing across their mind. And so a lot of my storytelling is thinking about structuring that particular mystery. So I'm less interested in trying to create like a nail biting edge of your seat kind of mystery, but more of like a deeper psychological and emotional mystery. And to me, that takes time, and building that kind of ambiguity means that you have to give the viewer time to piece it out and kind of bring their own perspective and their own, experiences to the table. And it's pretty, I rarely think about this while I'm actually working on something, because it's just kind of naturally internalized to me at this point. But it is very counter to how most stories are told, where it's really about efficiency and information and clarity. And I'm not often thinking about those things, except as they might relate to setting up a particular psychological or emotional ambiguity. Yeah. So sometimes I'm thinking like, how do I clearly and efficiently set up this thing that's going to take a long time and be ambiguous? Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Introducing those three women, they kind of take a mythological form or presence within the film. Share a little bit about that element, because that's also a rare element. The mythological pieces of storytelling. We're so used to just very linear stories with logical environments, and here you introduce something that it's almost outside of time. And this whole summer of these students doing their research, it feels like it's a moment outside of time, which I think plays really well with the ambiguity part.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it is mythological in a certain sense, but I tried to avoid being mythological in any sort of way that what I was doing would be beholden to any existing mythology. It's just kind of like using some broad structures. So like the idea of three mystical female beings is like sort of a trope in Western storytelling and Western mythology and religion. And so that was something I was pulling from. But when it came to actually trying to nail down what these characters wanted, I was much more thinking in the vein of something like My Neighbor Totoro, where you don't really know like what they're doing. Like, why are they meeting these beings? Who knows? Like, I don't know. I went a little further than that, in that these characters had to be closer in psychology to a person than like a Totoro would be. In that I wanted to make sure that there was a two-way sort of interaction going on, where not only did the scientist characters not know what was going on and were trying to understand like what these things were, but the beings who appeared, part of their their charge is they know that if they're appearing to people, that there's some thing that they're supposed to be doing, that there's some reason why this has happened. And so part of their trajectory is trying to figure out why they've been summoned to be with these people. What is going on with these people? Is there something they're supposed to do? Is there something they're supposed to help them with? Like, what is their purpose in having been brought forth? And eventually, hopefully by the end of the story, you get to the point of like mutual recognition of like why these two groups of entities like needed to come together. Like what was the kind of like overarching divine thing they were going toward? Like what were they leading toward, that nexus point? And that was really all the restrictions I wanted to put on it. But it was just within that boundary, thinking about what would be most interesting to me at different points, whether it's, you know, things that would be funny, things that would be startling, or things that would, you know, just be delightful in a certain way, like things you wouldn't expect, and just let those things come to the fore in terms of how the interactions were working. So, but about the idea that it takes place outside of time, I didn't really realize this until after we had finished the film, but I think some of the feelings that came from this, especially the interaction with the supernatural beings, is from this book that my mom got me when I was a kid, where like you could get it customized to put a kid's name in the book, and then it's like the book is about them. But it was like, it was for my birthday, and the book was about like, happy birthday, Brandon, for your birthday, you're being whisked away to the land of the dinosaurs. And so like I met all these dinosaurs in the story, and then at the end they like surprised me with a birthday cake, but then I had to leave. And every time I would read this as a kid, it would like wreck me emotionally, because I had made all these friends who felt like had been the nicest people to me, and then I had to leave them in the story, and it felt so just like emotionally evacuating. And so part of it also was trying to capture some sense of that emotion when the beings leave, and you really feel like how much has happened with them, and how, you know, it feels like this kind of thing where the characters have formed this bond with them that they'll never really be able to get back in a tactile sense, but that will, you know, stay with them in some kind of an emotional or spiritual sense. So that was part of it too. Part of that arc of, which I think is like a common arc of being whisked away to another world and then having to return, except it was a little different, where it was like beings from some other plane of existence, like briefly entered into their lives and then were gone.
Remind me, the professor's name, was that Robert?
Yeah, the character's name is Clarence Rumble, Dr. Rumble. Yeah, that's
Dr.
Robert.
Rumble.
Yeah.
So, you know, one question that came to mind when I watched it twice. I watched the film twice, and both times I was wondering if those three beings were not introduced into the story, and they had not read the readings of the cards, would the professor's fate still be the same as it was in the end, or would it be on a different trajectory if they had not been introduced?
It's a great question. I mean, I think to me, it's possible that he could have had the same fate in terms of his fall and his death, but maybe what happens afterwards, his kind of like deliverance in a certain way, wouldn't have happened. And maybe, you know, there's part of there are like a series of whispers in the film that you don't actually hear what they are. And I think the first time through, you might not necessarily be able to guess. I mean, maybe you can. It's designed so that you could guess. When they're doing the card reading and she whispers to him what she tells him,
Right.
And I think, to me, she says something like, uh, if you go to this place, then you're going to die. And it's like gonna happen soon.
Hmm.
And so there's the sense that how does knowing that change his experience of like his last bit of time on Earth? And what does it mean then if he knows that when he goes up there deliberately at the end of like his long night of drinking on the four-wheeler, uh how does that change that last outlook over the forest that he loves and like the wind hitting his face?
Hmm.
Does he feel love for that as strongly without their presence in those last moments? Like, those are the ways that it would change in my mind. But it's possible that none of it happens exactly the way it does without them.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, that's always the question of like destiny in a story, is whether is
Right.
exactly, it's almost like one of those time travel paradoxes.
Hmm.
um yeah, it's an interesting question. I actually haven't thought about that specifically, but pretty interesting question, I gotta say.
Yeah, it plays up that mystery of
Mm-hmm.
how things interact with each other uh, within this world. And if one thing, if it's the logic of if this then that, if they did this then would that happen as well. And that was a mystery that I felt just elevated
Mm-hmm.
as that scene was unfolding, and you could tell something was brewing. And as she was whispering in the ear, at the first time I watched it, I couldn't tell if it was negative or if it was going to be positive.
Mm-hmm.
But you could tell it was serious. Whatever it was something very serious, and he had to take it seriously.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I think part of what you're saying in that mystery of exactly what would happen is another consequence of trying at different times to think about the story from the perspective of beings who are kind of outside of humanity or outside
hmm,
of time, in the same way that you're thinking,
hmm.
that like does cause and effect, and if then logic even makes sense to them in that certain way. um yeah, it's just another another thing that your question made me think of. It's a great question.
um, so what's you made this film, and now we're in the age of COVID and this pandemic. What is the next what does the next year look like for you? Are you on hold with your film projects, or do you have something that you're working towards?
It's a great question. I mean, it's been a sort of a puzzle, even just figuring out exactly what's happening with this film, because there was so much uh, disagreement and confusion about exactly what role festivals would play and how it
Hmm.
would happen and what was best for each particular film. So we're still figuring out exactly. I mean, our sort of approach was to try to embrace virtual festivals as much as possible, because
Hmm.
having conversations like this is one of the great things about film festivals. If you're a filmmaker, is you get to talk with people about your work in a way that's, um, can inspire you to think about your work in different ways, or that's just really enriching to kind of get a sense of how your work has affected people or caused them to think in particular ways. But as far as so it's still figuring out, okay, after festivals, what happens with this movie? I don't know how that's going to pan out
Hmm.
exactly in coronavirus world. But then for upcoming films, I've spent a lot of time writing and prepping, and I have my next film is going to be half live action and half animated, so it's like split into two stories.
Hmm.
Um, and it's both stories are kind of like um, supernatural horror films in their own way, but they're kind of they parallel each other in some ways. So what I'm doing right now, because especially for people who are working at with limited resources, it's basically impossible to shoot especially if you're shooting with SAG actors or anything, because things have gotten so much more expensive and it would be so complicated to do. So I'm focusing on the animation part of that next script right now, because it's something that we can make progress on without having to actually be out shooting with lots of people gathered in one place. So that's what I'm going to be focused on for the next year, is really trying to get that locked in, and then just thinking about prepping the live action part of that. And then I have another script that I have in development too, that I need to that I can think about, that has a lot of set construction in it, which will be the first time really doing that for me. So there's lots of other planning that we can do in that way. It's just trying to shift as much lots of people in the same place kind of work as we can into this time period, because obviously most filmmaking involves putting lots of people in the same place and traveling and things like that. And so just picking out what parts of the process we can kind of lump together right now until it becomes feasible to do the other parts of it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Brandon, you've mentioned several times other directors, and I know you've referenced Miyazaki and even Twin Peaks in, I think, your cover letter to us. What classic film or non-classic film has inspired you the most? Supporting this narrative of yours.
For this film in particular,
right?
Miyazaki films were so critical to just so much of how I find so much of how influence works once you get past really formative influences. So like really formative influences for me are like Robert Bresson, Ingmar Bergman, David Lynch for sure. But then once you get past that, I feel like a lot of stuff, and a lot of that for me has been, a lot of it is recognizing parts of yourself and other people's work, and then having those parts of your creative self legitimized by seeing other people working towards those things. And so that's been that was a huge part of those formative influences. And then with each individual project, I feel like influence often works as like a series of permissions, where it's like, if someone else has done this, then it makes me feel like it's possible to do something else that's like in a similar vein, but like different. So seeing My Neighbor Totoro is like, I don't know if people would necessarily make the connection between that film and A Dim Valley, but to me, that was the film that made me feel like, oh, you can just do that. If I feel like doing that, if that's like where I'm going, then I can just do that, and it's going to be okay. And that's how a lot of that stuff works for me. And then increasingly, I think about influences probably less now than I used to, just because I've worked, when you're first starting out, you kind of work through those influences a lot and figure out what exactly you're taking from them and what stuff you're leaving behind. Right. But eventually it just becomes part of your instinct. And then now the things I get most excited about are filmmakers who are really committed to pursuing their particular project. Like, this is what I'm interested in for my career, and I'm going to do this without compromise, and like make my thing and do things my kind of way. And even at the point of designing a mode of production. So like outside of the script, just like, how do you make the movies consistently and do it repeatedly on your own terms? And so a lot of what I think of as how I'm modeling myself after filmmakers is often less so about like story and style at this point, because those things feel almost automatic. Like it gets more and more automatic as I go, where it's just like, it just comes quickly and I can just like write it and know exactly how I'm going to do it. But the like shaping of the career and thinking about mode of production and thinking about like how filmmakers fight to keep doing things the way they want to do them, that's something that's really where influence is for me right now. So when I see, you know, a career of someone like Agnes Varda or like Eric Romer or Peter Greenaway, people who make lots of films and do them frequently, and they're doing them exactly how they want, and sometimes doing them in ways that like no one else ever did it. Like they're figuring out how to shape a career in a way that's unprecedented. That's really inspiring to me, especially because I find the structure of the conventional American film industry to be like really unsatisfactory and uninteresting to me as a filmmaker. And I don't like the very sort of like capitalist, like boss at the top, filmmakers at the bottom approach of like, you need to seek permission before you can make your art. Like the idea of having to seek permission from a studio head or from someone who's like a centralized figure within how movie financing works, or connecting you to the resources you need works. I find that like really, like I can't imagine ever working in that world. And so I try to gravitate towards filmmakers who find a way to be sustainable in their practice outside of that and figure out what they're doing and how I can try to replicate it. Sorry, I may have ventured into territory far afield of your question, but
not at all. I really appreciate you mentioning Bresson. Your film Dim Valley has very precise dialogue, and there's not a lot of dialogue. Mm-hmm. And something I remember from Bresson, really doing well is, he would advocate if you're satisfying the eye, don't give to the ear. If you're satisfying the ear, don't give to the eye. And, you didn't need to fill a Dim Valley with a lot of talking about what's happening. You could just show what's happening, and that would satisfy the need. And you didn't need both the eye and the ear to be overstimulated to follow along in this narrative. And I think that came through really well.
Yeah, I mean, that was a completely mind-altering idea when I first encountered it. And it was something that, it's one of the great things about Bresson, and particularly his writing on his own work and on films, is it crystallizes so many things that you might intuitively have a sense for. Like, I think I probably, David Lynch was really my way into getting into films when I was a teenager. And there's something in the way he approaches sound and the way he approaches dialogue and performance where he's getting extremely different results than Bresson. But I think he understands that same idea, that like sound doesn't just have to buttress what you're seeing. It can be like a counterpoint, or it can add like a totally different layer to it. And that, so much of movies is like watching people look at stuff and try to imagine what's going on in their head. So like if you look at my scripts, a lot of times I'm specifying exactly where people are looking at which times, because the looks to me are equally important, if not more important, than the dialogue. But they're part of the same structure. Like if you're thinking of it as a composition and there are notes, well, dialogue is a note and a look is a note. And so it's like, how are you stringing those notes together is really what's building the interaction in the scene. And sometimes it means sound becomes another kind of note in that same like melody. Like when does a sound serve the same function, or when does a silence serve the same function? And so, those are all different kinds of things you can put in the same kind of structural cavity. And it's just like what needs to be plugged in at what time to kind of build the rhythm that you want. And so much of that rhythm is about feeling. Like a combination of structuring the feeling, but also structuring what we had mentioned earlier, which is how the viewer is processing this mystery of feeling. So like trying to create something the viewer can latch onto at the same time you're giving the viewer the like footholds for them to latch onto. So it's like you're building the mountain and building the footholds up the mountain at the same time, and hoping you can lead someone to the top by like having just enough mountain ahead of them so that they're always climbing but always kind of seeing, and then you reach the end.
And what's the
That was a
end?
lot of metaphors. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
In your mind, what's the end? What does that top of the mountain look like?
Just how the viewer feels at the end, like when the credits roll, how do you feel?
Yeah.
And that's what I'm always thinking about building toward is, and people often say like, I didn't realize how emotionally affected I was by the movie until like the last shot, or until like the last song started, or in some of my other films the same thing happens. And to me that is great, because it does another thing that Bresson talks about, which is another huge lesson I learned from him, which is that a film should be more than the sum of its parts. So that what you're creating is a system of images and sounds that are going to accumulate and compound one another, so that by the time you get to the end, it should feel like there's an overall emotional load that comes that you might not even be able to trace back to like particular moments or particular details, but it's like the snowballing effect. And sometimes it's kind of unexpected when it happens. And so I do think about that, and I think about how like the overall structure of the composition is going to hopefully lead to that point. So that right when you get to the end, as much as possible, the like emotional effect of the movie is like crashing into you. But it doesn't always work. I mean, if I often tell students that one of the problems with the way we think about visual storytelling in film and television is that we expect it to be a mechanism that always works in spite of the viewer's mood or circumstance. But if you compare that to something like music, there are appropriate times for certain kinds of music. There are appropriate times for other kinds of music. If you're wanting to go have, like a more raucous time, you probably don't want to put on some like low-key ambient music. Like it's not going to fit what you're doing. But if you're going for a more introspective experience, then you might want like a slower, more open, less propulsive kind of music. And to me, when I'm making films, I make films that are in a certain kind of emotional register, and there are always going to be people who are not going to be vibing with that when they watch it. And sometimes it's just, maybe if they gave it another shot, it would be different. But the way I make movies, it really depends on the viewer being receptive to what the movie is. And I'm not making stuff that's like trying to condition the viewer to love it in a certain way. Like it's not like I'm not creating a machine that's like gonna get its claws in you and never let you go, like that whole idea of writing a script where it's like hook them and never let them breathe for 90 minutes. I don't do that, because that's not the kind of thing I can do. So yeah, there's a certain amount of leaning into the film that is required for it to work for people, I think.
Man, Brandon, I could talk Bresson and Eric Romer all day with you if we had the time. It's so, just so interesting. Romer approached dialogue just very precisely, writing every syllable, wouldn't let his actors, deviate from the script at all. It was just locked and loaded. And then Bresson had very little dialogue, but they would take so many retakes over and over and over just to perfect, that blank stare, just right. And it wouldn't even have any dialogue in it. I'm thinking of like The Man Escapes or Pickpocket, where they just had so many reshoots, but without any dialogue, which is just unheard of.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a great example of that stare that you're talking about. That the stare holds as much weight as a sentence full of words and syllables, and it can convey so much where words just aren't as necessary in those moments.
Yeah, I mean, I love both of those filmmakers. They definitely do things really differently. My last film, I think, was more Sabbatical, was more extreme in its minimalism, because the emotion that I was going for was suited to that. Like, that was a much darker film that was really somber and about like isolation from your family and alienation in a certain way. In this film, I needed to leaven some of that with personality in a certain way. And so it was an interesting moment where I was seeing how some of the principles from Bresson that are really important to me, ultimately to achieve what I needed to do creatively. I mean, this was true on my other films too, but you have to realize that you're not going for exactly what Bresson is going for, even if you can kind of learn some guidelines and just like precepts to have in your head that can help you like cut through the confusion of a creative situation. Like, that's what can be so helpful about having some of those principles. Unfortunately, there's so much about mainstream storytelling that we get from television and Hollywood that people say they have precepts too, and they have like heuristics for how you solve a problem. They have like, if this situation, do this. But there's like an unspoken and often uninterrogated goal that's informing the precepts that they're choosing. And I think one of the most powerful things about finding filmmakers who can be your like masters in a master apprentice kind of way is they can give you an alternative set of heuristics and help you, and you can choose them based on what your goals are. So it's not about like what the industry perceives as success, which is very like audience oriented and about replicating models of storytelling that have succeeded with large audiences. But it's more about your creative ideals and what your expressive tendencies are, and finding other filmmakers who are able to be those guiding lights for you toward those ends and give you those heuristics that you can keep in mind when you're solving problems, so that you're not always solving problems in the way that's like the default for most filmmakers in this country, or anyone who's raised on conventional storytelling, which is like you internalize those things. Of course you do. And so a lot of the process of getting into those filmmakers was about reversing that internalization and giving myself strong what exactly am I thinking of? Like placeholder, no, strong, just like guidelines that would help keep me from falling into bad habits that I didn't actually want to be in, but that were just easy to default to because they're like the background of all of most filmmaking.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's a great perspective to hear and to have.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I hope I didn't ramble too much about it.
No, not at all. This is what this is all about. Just to, hear you speak and hear you share. In closing, is there anything else you want to add about your film or, to the audience here in Billings?
Well, I mean, I think if folks watch the movie and have questions or want to ask me about it, you can follow me on Twitter or send me an email. I'm happy to talk with people who watch the film about the film. So really, I'm not inaccessible. So if you want to chat about it, I'm happy to chat about it.
And what's your Twitter handle?
It's at Moss Garden Film.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Brandon. I appreciate your time and for giving us a few minutes to talk about A Dim Valley. If you are watching this and you haven't seen A Dim Valley, we recommend you check it out before the 10th of October. And I hope you enjoy that. And Brandon, we look forward to seeing what you come up with next.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for a fun conversation.
Yeah, you bet.